How prepared did you get, I guess is the question.
Um, I mean, I've read the book before, but didn't reread it this week.
That's what I'm doing again. I'm actually rereading the whole thing. I read it earlier. I think this might be my second or third time going through it, reading it again. And well, you can spend a lot of time just in the early parts of this when he starts talking about the unveiling of good.
Yes.
It's like, oof, oof. Um,
And I think what it is that stands out so much is how much deeper the medievals have thought through things, and
I was thinking.
how shallow we are as modern people.
No, I was thinking about that. So as I was looking at the poetry that he starts quoting and laying out, one of the things immediately I started saying, man, this is so um simple. The poetry, the stanzas, the way they build up, it's like this is really simple poetry um in the format, but it's not simple in the words used. The complexity of what he's revealing in the poetry is rich, so that
Right.
even though the poetry is very simply laid in the rhythms or in the format, it's it's not it's very complex in what he's portraying, what Spencer's
Right.
portraying. So you have to work really hard. I'm like, yeah, you can read through this and hear all the words and understand what he's talking about in some basic form. At least know that what the words communicate. But in the what the poetry does and the parallel that it makes, you don't just grab that, so quick. And so I was
Yeah.
thinking, I was like, man, these guys were using very basic forms of poetry to communicate really rich and massive thoughts. And I don't think that we think like that at all.
Yeah. Well, I think we use poetry to veil our shallows, and
Uh,
they use poetry to unveil their depths. I mean, I think that's the what's I
oh,
always
that's
find
funny.
fascinating.
You're right. We do. That's exactly right. We use poetry to veil our shallow. And that's why we have to have very complex outward. So when you look at it, it's the complexity is in the structure,
Right. Yeah.
not in the imagery.
Yeah. And so you sit and say, "Wow, what does this mean?" I mean, I just went and watched the the new Wes Anderson with my oldest son.
What's it called?
Um, oh man, it's and it's really a fascinating movie, but we both walked away saying, what was that movie about?" Asteroid City is what it's called.
Okay. Oh yeah, yeah.
We both walked away saying, "What was that about?" And we had to think through and think hard, and I think we figured it out, but um it wasn't a straightforward, here's the story, here's what it's about. And it's told, it's a layered story about a play being put on. And so you've got the front stage and the backstage, and then you've also got the flashbacks to when it was being written. So you got three stories being told, and so some of it was just that. But when you get to it, there's it, at the base, there's just a fear that there's no meaning, right? That's what's at the base of all of it. And if an alien shows up, does that does that mean there's more meaning or less meaning in the universe? And that's what it's
Right.
about. Is there meaning in the universe, is the question that's being put forward. And does,
Don't you have to have meaning just to be able to ask the question?
well, you and I know that because we have read just a tad bit of philosophical apologetics. You
Right.
realize that you have to have a foundation under the question in the first place. Um, and the so but what makes the movie so interesting is, in order to get people to wrestle with that issue, because we are such a shallow people, you have to make a really complex story that gives them the illusion that they're wrestling with something hard.
Mm.
but it's actually a really simple question, um, that really ends up with a 3 premise answer. Um, if you can ask the question about meaning and people understand it, the, um, then how would you put it? Then there must have been meaning already before you brought to bring your question to it, right? If communication is possible, then um, then there must be ultimate meaning somewhere in the universe.
It's funny. Is this why our preaching is so problematic? Because I think that we struggle with this from two different ends of the spectrum. I think you have kind of your EV free, um, very shallow evangelicals who are trying to um, water down as much theology as they possibly can with a big parade or a show that seems complex. And so they put the same way that they do. As you're talking about this, I'm just seeing the same setup inside of our some of our larger churches, or you say mega churches, or just churches that are trying to reach people. Let's just say all their motives are pure. They have a very basic, shallow message that isn't really deep, that's very surface, but then they have this huge, complex structures around it. So they'll have like a huge show, and then they have this timing with the music, and the sermon changes perfectly. And then they have, you know what I mean? Everything's just
Yeah.
so intricately built together. And so that all the message, then when it's time to be preached, like they have your attention to try and get this in you, right? Um, and the message is shallow, so you can grab it. So it's kind of like our poetry in the same way. But then on the other side, we have this complexity in how we use our exegesis, you know, where it's like we cover up the meaning that's not shouldn't be covered up with this huge extravagant look of I know how to use grammatical um diagramming instead. The messages.
Yeah.
So we do the same thing on both sides, one way or the other.
Well, and I would say that generally with the grammatical historical method too, you get really simplistic liturgies, right? With
Mm,
no often with no sacramental there's nothing sacramental in your liturgies, right? You do your baptisms outside the service, um, even, and then there's the Lord's Supper is rare. So there's no
mm,
G.K. Chesterton says that we're the kind of creature that need to be simultaneously um, at home and on an adventure, right? All the
mm.
time. That we're built for two things that don't coexist well.
Leave it to the paradox master to say
Yeah,
something like
exactly.
that.
So finding the satisfaction of both our being built for adventure and being built for home means that we have to figure out how how the veiling of reality functions and works, right? So that we can realize that being home, raising children, um, the that raising a family, having a yard, doing weekly barbecues, right? That there's a deep adventure to that. And whenever we're sent off on an adventure, there's a way there's a way to do that because we care about home, and there's a way to do that to escape home, right? that
Mm,
that those two things that look at first glance to be opposed are actually depend upon one another. It's not an if you don't love home, then being away never becomes an adventure, right?
mm,
If you don't love home, then being away is just part of the escape of the prison of home. Whereas if you love home and you can't wait to get there, then being away becomes an adventure. Uh, and that I think is what our liturgies lack.
mm,
Right? We need both of those things to be true. And historically, um, we've the liturgical theology kind of flops between the two errors of trying to make it very hyper spiritual, you know, um, and so you get the mystics, and you know a number of, I mean, many of which really love the Lord. You get in our day the charismatic, the very charismatic, or you might have a better word for it, because it's not just, because your day in day out charismatic is not somebody who I'm talking about, but like the people where every time you get together, if there's not a miracle or a prophecy, or that something has gone wrong, right, that the Spirit has withdrawn from us, because life is a constant um supernatural event,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Like the
So you've got
hyper
that,
charismatic. Yeah.
yeah, the hyper charismatic. But I think that's an insult to your regular charismatic, to, like hyper Calvinism isn't really Calvinism. Hyper charismatic isn't your normal charismatic, that
Yeah.
worships the Lord, and but thinks that there still weird stuff happens, that sort of thing.
But hyper charismatics and regular charismatics get along a lot better than hyper Calvinists.
Yeah, you're probably right. I don't have a ton of experience in that world, but I grew up in a family of responsible charismatics, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So I've got this, my experience of charismatics are all these incredibly Bible loving, responsible Christians, who don't have a regular weekly liturgy, right? Every week you expect the Spirit to guide and direct
Yeah.
you with a different liturgy. You don't have the regularity of a liturgy that you can come to feel home in. But
It's
it
so true.
isn't. Yeah, right. So
Yeah.
but you can fall, you can tip away from that error, um, and what you end up just not seeing your liturgy, right? Because you will
Yeah.
develop one. A people group will develop one.
Matter
Now,
of
at the
fact,
same time, go ahead.
matter of fact, if something is ordered consistently, that is evidence that the Spirit is not moving, right? Like,
Right,
right, like we
right.
need to have something like, well, we weren't planning on that, and then the Spirit comes in and messes up. You're like, woo, yeah, that's something went down now.
Yeah,
The
right,
Spirit is moving. We got him in here. We working, right? Because
right,
of the fact that the order has been, if there is an order that we typically flow in, it's been interrupted, right? And
right,
that's how we know the Spirit is operating.
right. And the so there's never a place to settle in and say, no, this is home, right?
Mm,
I'm at home base right now. This is liturgical home. The comforts of a weekly liturgy, but you can fall the other direction to where you no longer believe that there is something spiritual, big S spiritual going on, and that it becomes a materialistic um, event, right? That why do we do the sacraments? Well, because they remind us of something, right? It's a brain chemistry need,
mm,
that is fulfilled by the sacraments, right? We're the kind of creature that need visual stimuli to bring us to the proper understanding. And so, um, and I have even heard folks in that camp say things along the lines of, well, God stoops to our immaturities. And
mm.
so there are some people that really still need poetic and visual stimuli. They wouldn't even say poetic, but
No, yeah,
visual stimuli. Um, and because of their immaturities, God stoops to our immaturities. But eventually, we all grow out of the need for the sacraments. And that kind of Gnostic, that's much more the temptation on the Reformed side of things, right? To think
really.
that, yeah, that you get that what you have is um that the liturgies are more reminders than they are anything else.
When you say
Um,
liturgy, are you just talking about the format in which we do service and communion and the baptism? Well, what do
yep,
you mean
yeah,
by
yeah,
liturgy? Yeah, okay.
liturgy. So like, um, you're called into worship. You are
The five
um
C's.
the five C's, um, and there's disagreements kind of about what order, but they're generally, you get the five C's in liturgical settings or historically informed liturgies, um, which is call to worship, confession, consecration, communion, and benediction. I can't remember what the last C is.
Is
But
commission.
commission, yeah. So you're uh and there, historically, if you read somebody like John Calvin or Augustine or um pretty much anyone in the Middle Ages, that they have a liturgical theology that says that the Spirit of God promises to be with us on a Sunday when we gather, and then the means of grace are the liturgical movements, right? So when during the service, when the pastor stands up and speaks, he's speaking on behalf of Christ. He is the official mouthpiece of the body of Christ who speaks God's word. And that's why it's so important that he knows the word and he loves the word and he stays close to the word, is because his job is to be the ambassador of the king who speaks the word. And in the liturgical setting, he is in his official capacity as ambassador the entire time. And so he is speaking the word. He's declaring what God, he's declaring God's part of it. I mean, this is why there's certain aspects of the service that you have to be ordained in a liturgical setting. You have to be ordained to do certain parts of the service. Because you need an official ambassador to be able to speak with the authority of the word of God. So the word of God carries the authority of the God of whom spoke it. So all of that means that every service, in a liturgical setting, every service is an adventure, right? Every service is God showing up, and when God shows up, you expect things to be intense. You expect things to so by faith, when we hear the preacher preach, we expect it to hit home. We expect it to cut to the heart, because it's the word of God. It's God speaking to us. God is present, speaking by his Spirit.
So then every service really is a charismatic service, because what they're always looking for is like for God to show up, right?
Right.
But how they define that be a little different. But it's like, no, that's one of the words we said, God showed up today. It's like, well,
I think
yeah.
it's what are the marks? What are the marks of God
yeah,
showing up, right?
right.
So the marks of God showing up are when he comes, it says the Spirit will convict us of our sin. When he comes, it says the Spirit will forgive us of our sin, right? Those are the when Jesus gathered people together, he fed them, right? So we can expect when God shows up for a meal to be a part of it, right? So there's things, so by faith we see that we are in the presence of God, that we have been brought into the throne room of God, that we're gathered with the angels and the saints that have gone before, that we are on Mount Zion, right? All of those things are true, whether we can see them or not. And by faith, we do see them. Sometimes, somebody sees it by sight as well, but that's not better or superior or more real. When we come into the presence of God, we come into the presence of God, and by faith we expect to be changed, to become more like him, to hear from him, and to hear him speak into our specific setting, and all of those things.
So then speaking of this, and like we were talking about before, with kind of like what we were talking about with poetry, and the complexity
yes.
of it.
So in the Middle Ages, they believed that the world, that the physical world was veiled communication, or veiled poetry from God, telling us what he's like and what he wants from us, right? It was all communication, but there's a veil over it, and that poetry was the proper way to lift the veil, to see general revelation as revelation, right? Poetry was the means wisdom gathering, right? So that the wise man sees sees all of creation as general revelation, sees it as real revelation um, that's general. So it's authoritative. It's not specific in an authoritative way. It's general in a non-authoritative revelation, right? So you have so it's not so it but it's still revelation, and that the proper means of gathering the revelation is poetry. Poetry is the way you lift the veil. So there's a lot of wisdom to be gathered studying the world, the way it works, history, the way God has worked throughout history. There's a lot of wisdom to be gathered, and the proper means of lifting the veil is poetry. So poetry takes the complex communication of creation and simplifies it to us.
Mm.
We no longer believe that, and so our poetry is complex. Our poetry becomes the difficult thing, rather than because we don't have it's not trying to communicate. It's not trying to simplify something that's communicated in a complex way. It's purposefully making something complex because we still need something complex as humans. So yeah, that was what got us started there.
So then what is creation then? In that perspective, if poetry needs to be complex, but you need the poetry. So yeah, that's really interesting. Let me think through. So the poetry is a way of taking something that's complex to give a revelation to someone, right? To reveal to them the thing that they're seeing, what it is. But if you start making your poetry complex, then what are you saying about the creation itself?
Well, I think what you're saying usually is that it has stopped communicating to us, right?
So we
So
have to dress up. We got to cover it up then, because it's already.
Yeah. So this is so a lot of this has to do with really the new astronomy. So because the new astronomy is what emptied poetry, right? When you started getting the new astronomy, which is that the world is that we are a rock floating through space, that we are on a rock floating through space, that we happen to be the one wet rock in the universe floating through space, and then everything else is dark, cold, empty, and silent, right? When that astronomy came in and reoriented the imagination of mankind, you started getting modern poetry, which complicated and became a way of veiling creation, because we
Mm.
unveiled it. We thought we unveiled it and found something terrifying. I mean, it's like the opening of Annie Hall, the movie Annie Hall. You've got the 13-year-old who studies astronomy and learns about cold death, entropy and cold death, and he stops doing his homework because he says, "What's the point?" Right? What's the point of studying anything if you peek under the skirts of reality and find cold, empty, quiet death, right? And that's where everything's headed. And
Is that what they is that what they found? Because you said they found something they didn't like. Is that what they? Because maybe I'm wrong in thinking about this, but I mean, what if what they found was something that, like, oh, I feel like I'm gonna be. I was just thinking of the children of Israel when they come to the Mount of God and then they hear God and they're like, nope, nope. You go up there, Moses. You go talk to that thunderous God, and because we'll die trying to go any further on this. So you go talk to him. But when Moses goes to talk and to bring them back, they straight just drop into full idolatry, right?
well,
Because
right.
of what
So
they found.
I
It was
think
terrible.
I think this is one of those interesting things with that. we don't like to talk about. When somebody says, when you ask somebody what space is like,
Yeah.
and they start describing it, you say, "Man, did you ever go there? Have you experienced it?" They obviously they haven't, unless they're one of the 8 people alive now, I think, that have been to space or something. It's not very many. It's less than 20. Say, well, so you haven't been there, so you're depending upon the reports of an authority, right? So yes, I'm depending upon the reports of an authority, but the way it's been so effective that every single person depends upon the reports of those handful of authorities, and imagine the same thing, right? It's been an incredibly effective. Um, oh man, I don't want to call it propaganda because that makes it sound like it was purposefully evil. But it's an incredibly effective communication that you can get the entire world to imagine space the same way. So, but you've had that before, right? If you asked somebody in 1400, tell me about Earth, they would have the same sort of thing. It's just they have a different cosmology, and so they describe it different. But the cosmology that we have described is a materialist cosmology, and Christians have assumed it just as much as anyone else. Right? So, our liturgical expressions all are basically reflections of the modern astronomy.
Okay. No, you don't get to. Mm-mm. No. Are you telling me that you don't believe space is cold? Are you and like
Well, I haven't been there, so I don't know if it's cold or not, but I don't actually believe that it is dark and silent, and full of death. I the
mm,
um because we're told, for one, that we're told that it's full of angels, that it's full of music, that it's full of um that we've got that there's a giant dance going on up there. And um so I mean, I just saw something crazy, and it was one of those things where it went by in a reel, and didn't know. I don't know what I'm doing, so I
how to
couldn't
get back
save it.
to I hate when that happens. I
Yeah,
know exactly what you're talking about. I've
but
experienced that one.
it was it was a guy talking about it was a guy that um he was a professional. He dealt with people that had been abducted by aliens, and he had over 100 cases where the aliens explained the gospel of Jesus Christ to someone. And he was saying, like, he's keeps being told he's not allowed to talk about it.
Mm,
It's like, but he's like, not all the aliens do, because there's other aliens that come with talking all about um that. But he said, the aliens almost always have some sort of spiritual message, either
mm,
pro Jesus or anti Jesus, right?
mm.
And he's just that this is what he does, is he interviews people that have been abducted by aliens. And it's one of those things where you're like, well, that's crazy.
Uh-huh.
So maybe the aliens are just angels that are coming down. They're like, look, don't let him trick you. Jesus really is who he says he is. But that's so speculative. I'm just, that's just
Why
would
wouldn't
be a
you
fun.
I
That'd be a fun thing to find out someday.
I have a feeling that you want to be in a room where they interview the guys who've been abducted by aliens.
Whoa! Oh my gosh! Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you want to be? I would in a second. Use
I
it.
got no, that's
You.
white people problems. That's y'all. Y'all want to do stuff like that. I got different. I got enough problems dealing with my own. I don't need to deal with no aliens. I ain't got,
When
no.
when they were taking married couple applicants to go to Mars, I brought home the application, and my wife wouldn't let me fill it out. I was
You
like,
know
"Look,
what?
you don't want to go to Mars? I want to go to Mars. I am." I would in a second take one of those trips to the moon.
Oh,
Take one of those,
why don't you trust the account of the people who have experienced space when they talk about how cold it is? Um, they're what they come back with that they don't. Why don't you trust their account?
Well, I don't think it's that I don't trust their account. It's just that it's the same people that tell us a fetus is a clump of cells,
Okay, you ain't had to say
right?
less.
Yeah.
They're the ones that tell us to put on a mask. I get it.
Right. So the if you look at a fetus and all you see is a clump of cells, that's what a fetus is made of, not what a fetus is, right? And so a report about what something is made of, you have not yet told me what a thing is, what a thing is, because so if you go into it with a metaphysic that doesn't already that that the metaphysic that Edmund Spencer is putting forward is that this whole place is veiled, and that part of Adam and Eve's job is to lift the veil and give everything its true name. Lift the veil, discover what everything truly is, and that's the job as Adam and Eve's descendants. That's the job. Well, if you don't believe that you're a priest after the order of Adam or a priestess after the order of Eve, if you don't believe that you are a king and queen whose job it is to discover the mysteries, then your reports are going to be thin, right? It'd be like, the person that
you know what? I got one. It's the way that we looked and did science on Black people, right?
Yeah.
Right. If you have a cosmology and a worldview that puts you guys completely in different categories of humans, or less human, then you start saying stuff like they got different brain sizes, so they're less intelligent. Right. We've done this, so we do it now with babies. We do it. We still do it all over the place. We do it with how we virtue signal of our skin complexions, right? As if that all of a sudden my complexion of my skin gives me a certain intelligence or virtue that no one else has, right? You're right. We do this in other, that's interesting. I never thought about it like that. So a broken cosmology, the broken metaphysic. Well, it starts with cosmology. Your cosmology is going to interpret your metaphysic.
Yeah, and we see this all the time. People that don't believe, people that don't believe in something, explain it away. Right? If you don't think something's possible, then your brain doesn't register it. Your mind doesn't register it. Or you explain it as something else. And there's famous scientists that talk about this, saying, look, we don't take all of the data into account because we already know what's not possible. Right. And so there's data that shows up that we ignore because we already know it's not possible. And that's how you do science, right? Well, that's how you do science in a materialistic universe, right? When we believe that the scientific method is the only way to get to true knowledge, or as close to true knowledge as you can get, then that's how you do science. When you pre-disbelieve something, you're not gonna hear whatever it is. So it's not that I don't believe their accounts of what they are, it's what they're saying, or think that they're liars, or believe, I believe that we went to the moon. I was
going to ask you that.
Deny the moon landing.
Yeah.
I think, or I'm not a flat earther or anything like that. I'm not a flat earther because I'm a classicist, and so I know we've known that the world was round since before Plato, right? The the roundness of the world was never questioned until you got to the modern times when they tried to tell us that the older view of the world couldn't possibly be true. They slandered the medievals and the ancient people by saying they believed in a flat earth. Nobody back then ever believed in a flat earth. They slandered the ancients and said they used to believe in a flat earth because they didn't have a straightforward way of convincing everybody of the new astronomy, of the new cosmology, right? They have to discredit the older cosmology, and they did it with lies.
How do you think that they're doing that now? And where do you think that it's, or do you think they've kind of won and then on?
Well, I think they've won, but I think that now the accusation is, oh, you're a flat earther. You know, if you start questioning anything, oh, I guess you're just a flat earther.
Right.
So it's the same sort of slander, but so, like, for example, if I was talking to somebody and I said, well, what do you believe is the center? If they ask would you believe the earth is the center of the universe? And I said something along the lines of, well, I believe that the universe is 4-dimensional space, so there isn't a center in the third dimension so you have to pick something. You can pick the earth, it's just that makes the math more complex, or you can pick the sun, it makes the math less complex. But I don't think that saying the sun is the center is mathematically accurate, right? Say, oh, you some kind of crazy flat earther, right? It's like, well, no, actually, that's just geometry, right? That's just geometry tells us that, and but you're not allowed to, but that puts into question all of everybody's imagination, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the
yeah.
part that you're not really allowed to touch, is because the domination of a culture's imagination is the real power. That's the real control.
Well, see, as you said that, I was just thinking, okay, well, hold on, Jason. We know where the galaxy is, and we had understanding of the galaxy, so we know that. Remember, I sent you this one video where the galaxy is traveling through space,
Right.
and somebody said you think it's traveling like this, where it was fixed, and then they were just going around and around each other, and then the next clip, but it's actually traveling like this, and it was like shooting, through space, and it was elongated as it was going around, and I was like, oh my goodness, is this true? And you said, well, kind of.
Yeah. I mean, you can choose to imagine it from that perspective,
because you have to pick a point in order to be able to see it do that from, right?
Right. Exactly.
And so, but there is we don't have any. The only person who can mark the center would be God, because he's able to hold it all together, right? To see all the edges.
And that's the illusion is the objectivity.
The illusion is the objectivity. Okay.
The illusion is that we can say there's an objective spot from which we can step out of the universe and view it. Right.
That's not what God gave us at this point to operate, though, right?
Right. We're not that kind of creature, right? We're a subject within the universe, so we can't view it as an object because we're within the universe. So we don't have that sort of.
Stop. I just put something together. Is this what we're doing when the modern movement is doing, where it's the chain of being, right? Is that what it's the same sort of setup where it's like, oh, we're this type of being that we can be outside of it and observe it, right?
Yeah,
is that the same cosmology? Same
that's exactly it, right? So
Ah,
So and you see this all the time, like this is the problem with
oh,
most modern psychology. This is the problem with all of the attempts of evolutionary theory to undo religion, and all of them, they're self-defeating because we are not the kind of creature that can step out and see objectively, um
because oh man,
according
Jason,
yeah.
this I'm still putting this together, but because if we are, then we get to make up the rules of nature itself because we've
Right,
attained to that ability to be the objective, um, to see it objectively,
right. And
to observe. I'm trying to find the words to say this because yeah, that makes sense now. I can't verbalize it quite yet. We're trying to be the thing that gives it its objectivity.
right, we're trying to be the kind of creature that can describe from an objective perspective, right?
Mm,
But only God has an objective perspective of the
mm.
universe, right? Or even of us, right? Of we are always subjects within creation. Now we're priestly, we're in the priestly class, right? Which means that there's a certain amount of objectivity that we can have over things within our jurisdiction.
Right, right,
But
right.
right, and that's where we want to extend that priesthood beyond um what God has given us to be, what God has given us, and and that's why we end up with the nihilism. We end up priests of nothing, as the
Yeah.
nihilists called us, because we try to extend our priesthood out beyond the beyond reality
Well,
and see reality objectively.
but we're actually not trying to be priest anymore.
Right. We're trying to be the god of the system instead of the
Yeah,
priest
right.
of the god of the system.
The priest is selected and put in position. Like that's all Old
Right.
Testament, right? Like this is, hey, I've called out Aaron and him to and the Levites to be they are mine, right? This is what the priests do, right? But then what we're trying to do is like, that we want to call out and make the priest or who gets to be priest over what, right?
Right.
And it doesn't work like that. We're trying to change our own orientation as man, as priest of the planet, to being God of the universe.
Right. To being God. And then so then our authority structures, then when they start gathering up steam, they try to put their own priests in place. Right. And so I think that's what you've got right now with the um with the not really with the trans movement,
Yeah.
um that the trans movement, it's a way of functioning as a priesthood of of mutable reality,
Mm.
right? So um
This is what we talked about last time.
right, so but if you are powerful enough that to claim sort of godlike powers, we make the laws, we set the bounds of reality, we're in charge around here, rather than in submission to the King of Kings. I am the King of Kings. um then you need your own priesthood. And if the claim is that I'm powerful enough to affect reality, then you put a man in a dress and say everybody must call him a man in a dress. Everybody must call him a woman. This man in a dress. He is the priest of our powers. You
So that's
so you had the same thing with communism, where they would say, today you must call the grass blue.
right,
And we
right.
send, you say um where you can't, if you can't test our powers over reality, and so we send out our priests to make declarations that you have to submit to.
So then okay, so then what does a priesthood do?
um it Well,
A
the
priest.
central
Yeah.
the central job is to what's called oblate, right? Is to lift between. um and so you're lifting creation, up to its creator. That's the central thing that a priest does. And then in a as it in other ways you lift things up, right? So you bring the sacrifice of someone and you lift it to God. You bring the thanksgiving, the prayers of someone, and you lift them to God, right? So your job as a priest is to oblate, but the priesthood of Adam has us oblating creation through thankfulness, through the proper use, and through naming, right? That's what we do. We lift everything up to the Lord.
Let's do that again. What was it?
We lift it up to the Lord through using things in their proper way, with thankfulness, and then through naming, right? So those are the jobs that Adam and Eve are given. They go out and they name, and then they discover and they take dominion, right? They use things in their proper way. And we're told in Romans 1 that their priesthood went wrong when they stopped being thankful. Right? That was the heart of their priesthood is to lift thanks for everything that God has given. Right? So you've got this thankful naming oblation that we, as descendants of Adam and Eve, that's our central duty. We go out and we take dominion of a place, we name it, we are grateful for it, we bring it to its proper end, we grow tomatoes, and then we put them on the tables, lift them up to the Lord in thanksgiving, and then give them as gifts to one another.
Come on now. Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
and
so it's inescapable. Man's ability to be priest is inescapable.
Completely inescapable, right? You can't. And so
just being bad priest.
Right. Even when we fight against God, we fight in a priestly way, right? We fight against, right? So we try to be priests to other gods. Right. So we can't reject our own nature.
Is. Yeah.
That's what idolatry is, right? That's why, when I'm talking apologetics with people, that it's never a rational issue. It's always a which God issue, right? It's an idolatry issue that we're at that is at the heart of apologetics. Mm-hmm. So, for some people, rationalism is the way that the God that their idolatry shows itself. But anymore, that's a pretty slender group of folks. There's a reason that you have to go to a college campus to find somebody to argue with in a rational way, right? It's a pretty slender group. So instead, we're dealing with people who have taken their priesthoods and dedicated their priesthoods to false gods, and helping them see that, and then showing that the actual God makes a much better God than the false gods is apologetics.
Okay, so this is interesting, because so now was that all that it was as you're working through the idea and concept of a priest? Did we get through all of that?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure we did. So is unveiling a part of that too? Like, the priesthood job, as far, we're talking about creation. I guess you said find and discover, right? What God is. So name those three again. I got to write those. I didn't write those down. What is it? Those three things?
So, we're thankful. We find the proper use for things.
Metaphysical. What did you say? Metaphysical. How would you get proper use of things? Teleos.
Yeah, we discover. Yeah, so that it's where it comes from, what it's for, what its uses are, right? So it's dominion type of stuff. So like a tree. It turns out a tree has a ton of proper uses. Right? There's lots of different ways you can use wood, and and that's just, it's like George Washington Carver and the peanut, right? That's a priestly activity that he is involved in. Um, which ones have I said already?
Uh,
Right. We
thankfulness, proper use of it.
thankfulness, proper use and naming. Right. So we and those are all oblation activities, right? We're lifting up to the Lord what it is that we find. Hey, look at this. This thing is a turtle. What's
What
the
do you
proper
do
use
with
of
turtles?
what do you do with turtles, right?
Yeah.
You can raise them as pets. You can turn them into instruments.
And do you get this kind
Soup.
of oh, so okay, you can eat turtles. Okay.
You can eat turtles.
It's proper use. So is this what you get when you start seeing in the garden the types of trees? The
Yeah, each thing after its own type, and
okay. You got
but you
some
also
trees that are for food, some are for building,
yep.
and you get this and when you see Moses building the tabernacle and God is laying out for them, use this wood for this, use that for this, use these
Right.
metals, use, you know.
But even you get it too in Deuteronomy when you're told that when you go through and you defeat an enemy, you're not allowed to burn down all their fruit trees, right? Like
Right.
that God gave them those fruit trees for their prosperity, and total war um, is not the where you go in and you destroy everything so that they can't rebuild. Right? That's not the way
So
God's
nuclear
people
is off the
go to
table.
war. Nuclear is right out, right? It's not
Really?
is off the table. And as soon as we discovered what nuclear could do, we should have said, "Oh, that's right out. That's generational destruction. We don't do that.
Mm.
That's wrong." Right now, it like, and I've read through the arguments, like, and I get the center of the argument is generally, well, more Japanese would have died, right? And that may or may not have been true. We don't really. I mean, that's a speculative argument. But we know you're not allowed to leave the land desolate, and nuclear leaves the land desolate for not as long as we predicted. Right? Things came back quicker than expected
Mm-hmm.
after. The world, it has a much stronger regenerative power than we thought.
This is why you probably think we're wrong on space.
That's part of it, the yeah, and we yeah.
Oh, I gotta know now. You
Well,
started it.
there, we land on Mars and we find things like ice, and you go, wait a second, there shouldn't be ice on Mars. What's going on?
I meant to bring
Right?
this as you're saying. Go ahead. I'll
So,
let you finish. I gotta say something about
so
that.
the way science works is we're constantly adjusting our scientific knowledge but we have been told that through the scientific method we've landed now here, and this is permanent. But that's because we've shifted the use of the scientific method. That's a philosophical decision, not a scientific method decision. And I don't agree with the philosophical decision. I think the scientific method finds us certain kinds of knowledge, that helps us accomplish our priestly task that God has given us. But it's limited to its sphere. And as soon as they start saying, well, I would like to use scientific method outside of its sphere, then I say, no, I'm no longer going to accept those conclusions because you're outside of your sphere.
Which is the same way with the objective positioning, right? Like what we were talking about early. Everything then gets outside of its. Once you start moving your priesthood, right? Everything else gets moved too, right? You
Right.
don't, you don't stay. It doesn't start. Nothing operates the way it's supposed to, right?
Right.
Everything moves and shifts with that. Okay, it's as you were saying that I was thinking about something I saw with Glenn Beck. I think it was Charlie Duke who did an interview with Glenn Beck. He was an astronaut who during that time we went to the moon, and he was just talking about some of the things that they had thought scientifically they were going to have problems with, which was if the moon is just a dust ball or it had been out there for millions of years, it's going to have all this dust on it everywhere. And so they just assumed that if they were to step on it, that they would go right through. If they tried to land their craft, it would go right through all that dust and they would just sink. And so they had a whole plan designed to make sure they didn't sink, so that through all that dust there, and they got there and it was like nothing like they thought.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
And so, and I was thinking like,
there's like
I was like, that,
there's like a half inch of dust.
right, exactly. And
Yeah.
I was thinking, and I was like, that sounds really stupid now. Like I think about it now, it's like, why would you ever think that? That's dumb, you know? And I'm like, oh, yeah, we had a completely different. If you think it's millions, your presupposition was it's millions of years old. That's a lot of dust in one place for millions of years. Yeah, you're going
Right.
to sink through, right? But it's what is driving that? But if you actually have a Christian worldview as priest and you believe what God has told you about this place, then you know you're only going to have a couple thousand years worth of dust up there. You know, like, like, you know, and probably not even that. You know, so it's interesting when you said that. I completely like, yeah, I can see your position on this, especially, you know, I don't trust the other cosmological influence, the world according to the other cosmology. I don't trust that at all.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's funny. I don't think we question enough of that type of mindset in everything. Like we should come to it in everywhere area and be like, what is driving their understanding about this thing? How are these priests now observing this? Are they even giving thanks for it? And to who? You know, we should come now with a more skeptic mindset about their worldview in cosmology. I think we're skeptic of it when it comes to spiritual things, but we're not skeptic of it when it comes to the gifts God has given us to give thanks for.
Right.
You know,
And I think that's where, you know, when you read history, you see how often people are wrong at their guesses, even well-informed guesses, right? They guess the you know they guess here this is what the Chinese are going to be like, you know, and then they meet them and they're like, oh, they're not anything like what we had from, you know, we were putting together our guesses from we have a handful of data points and we put together our guesses and we're not even close. How much less should we expect our guesses about Mars?
right?
Like if we can't guess the other side of the world with creatures that are the same as us,
Yeah.
how much less are our guesses about Mars and Jupiter going to be? Now we're trying to get scientifically informed guesses, but science has to do with repeatability. And so science takes more time than other kinds of knowledge. And that's because of the kind of knowledge that it gathers for us, right? So it's inferential knowledge. You use the inferential logic, and that's its strength and its weakness, and so it gives it its limitations. And I think as Christians, we have accepted two things. We've accepted, on the one hand, Plato's definition of knowledge, which unless we have knowledge, the kind of knowledge that God has, we can't call it real knowledge. And then we've accepted that science gets us that kind of knowledge. And those two errors are at the heart of the Enlightenment, at the heart of the shift in the definition of mankind, the shift in the definition of what kind of creature we are, is we can have that objective knowledge that God has, and that science can get it for us. Science is the means to get us closest. Those two are errors are at the heart of all of the other errors, and so we don't know what to do with our lives anymore. I mean, so it ends up disrupting our lives, because the thing that actually brings us satisfaction is to settle into our priesthood in a particular place, in a particular time, with particular people, and accept it and do it well. That's the adventure that turns out to be satisfying. That's the adventure that can't be gotten to scientifically.
Mm. So then, is Spencer having the same conversation that we just had in The Image of Good, or is C.S. Lewis having the same conversation that we just had when we talk about the image of good?
Well, so what he's saying,
because there is that it's going back to the unveiling part again, right?
Right. So what he's saying is that the imagination of modern people is such that when we say, hey, give me some examples of the good, that we literally don't have that category, right?
Give
so
me
you might
some.
say, well, yeah.
Okay.
So if you say, well, what's the good life? People might talk about, yachts and helicopters and, perpetual vacation, sort of thing.
Not having to work.
Not having to work. Yeah. That's what the good life looks like. But images of goodness itself, we are nihilistic when we start talking about good. Our images of good are not bad. Our thing, here's the bad parts removed. We don't actually have positive images of the good, generally speaking, of goodness. So we're nihilists about the good.
What do you mean by nihilist?
We define something based on what's not in it. Right? We define according to what's not there. Right? So if I said, tell me about the good life, you say, well, I don't work, I don't have to worry about money. We don't define it. Here's the good things.
I don't have to get up. I don't.
Yeah.
Hakuna Matata.
Exactly.
No worries.
No worries. And
which, by the way, was the bad part of the song. That was the thing you're not supposed to be singing everywhere.
That's the temptation. That's the Temptation song. It's a super catchy tune. But if you remember it's the Temptation song, then it's a reminder when somebody brings the Hakuna Matata lifestyle to you and says, hey, here you go. Here's a get rich quick scheme. You say, no, Hakuna Matata. That's a temptation.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I know sometimes it comes sounding good, but I know where that leads.
Unfortunately, that's not how people are singing it. They're singing it like, oh man, I'm having a Hakuna Matata, man. That's where I need to be at.
Right. But so Spencer comes and tries to give a positive vision of the good for the imagination so people can take positive images of the good with them in their imagination. Right. So this is like, for me, when I was growing up, this is what Reepicheep did in the Prince Caspian and the Voyage of the Dawn Treader in the Narnia series, is you meet Reepicheep and you say, oh my gosh, that's who I want to be. That's the positive vision of good, right? That says, hey, there's a dragon down there. And the prince has to turn to Reepicheep and say, and before you even ask, Reep, you can't face it in single combat.
Man, we lost that. Yeah, you were saying that, I was thinking we did not have any of that during COVID. Right?
Very little.
I mean, there was not like, give them to me, I'll take on all of them. There was no Reepicheep in COVID. Everybody was like, well, we'll just try and do our thing and be quiet. We won't say anything. Like, everybody just calm down. We'll try. And it took like the whole thing got peeled back, and then people was like, "Oh, everybody's charging. I guess we're charging now." Right? There was no Reaper cheap where it's like, guys, I got this one. I got this one, and you got to hold Reaper cheap back because he'll take it on. That wasn't the tone set. So then feels like that we don't have a good concept of good, right? We don't have a concept of good. If that's what Reaper cheap, is doing there, charging off in the battle. So
he's ready to charge at any moment, right? He just has to be, but he also has the respect to listen to his king,
right?
When the king says it's not time to charge yet,
right? Right.
That the honor, and that combination of honor and courage is unheard of. I mean, you don't even run into it or see it or anything, right? So, and I think this is why young men get wrapped up in gangs and young men get pulled into that sort of thing, is they're being told their whole life like that honor and courage are bad things, and then there's somebody that says, well, no, you can, there's a use for your honor and courage over here. It's the wrong use, but it's an actual use for it. And so that's why it becomes a temptation is, I can have a brotherhood. I can have a brotherhood that I defend, that the honor and the courage that I feel I should have is, there's a use for it over there. The church should be giving a use for that honor and courage. Just you hear the church has embraced too much of the feminism of the modern world to be able to provide it for young men anymore.
I interrupted you, or you were talking about the image of good, and so
that's one. So you've so Reaper cheap is one of those images of good, but here it's Saint George, right? That's the he gives Saint George as one of the great images of good, who he is wandering the countryside under his vow to protect all women. And a woman, all women are safer if St. George is in the area, because that's what he does. And he comes across a king who was feeding the sheep to the dragon, and then when they ran out of sheep, gonna feed virgins to the dragon, including the princess. And he says, well, no, that's not what you do with dragons. You slay dragons. Which direction is this dragon you speak of? And so he goes out and he fights the dragon, and so it's that story is trying to give an image for the imagination that people can take with them as they go out into the real world, not because they're going to run into physical dragons regularly, right? It was rare then, just like it's rare now to run into real physical dragons. It still happens, but it's rare. But you are going to run into metaphorical dragons all the time, and you need a metaphor a metaphor that you can cast yourself in those situations. Who ought I to be when I run into metaphorical dragons? Well, I have to be a metaphorical Saint George. We don't let this is the reason that when we were talking about doing a kid show, I said episode 1 should be Saint George, right? For this very reason. And a story about a kid who doesn't have the picture in his imagination that makes him able to stand up to a bully to protect his sister until he hears the story of Saint George. Then he says, oh, that's who I'm supposed to be? That's got it. And so then the next time his sister needs someone to defend him, he's ready, because now his imagination has been discipled with the storytelling of Saint George, right? That is that, I mean, C.S. Lewis is saying that's how people function. Their imagination guides and directs them with images of what's good. We have lived in a time when the image for good has come from school marms and scared moms, that safety is the image of the best thing. That got us into this situation.
Well, and it's bled over. That form of effeminacy has bled over into how we do businesses too, or take our institutions. I think Nate's talked about this, where your institution is supposed to go into battle. It's supposed to get busted. It's supposed to have marks on it. It's supposed to, if it dies in battle, then it did what it was supposed to do, as it's going the right way, right? But most of us are trying to figure out how to keep our institutions safe and keep them. It's like, no, put your institution and what you're supposed to do with that. Put it in battle so that it's engaging. And if God decides to give you victory and your institution survives, great. And if God decides to, that you don't get victory by surviving this battle, but God gets victory because you were in battle, right? And so we take our institutions and we play them so safe. Safety is a form of like, it's good that we exist instead of it's good that we go fight. Right.
Yeah. It's the being survival is not itself a good.
Right.
That God didn't say go out and survive. Right. He said go out and die to yourself, take up your cross.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the image that he gives, and this is where I do think that often the grammatical historical, I don't want to make them the whipping boy, but this is where I've seen it most often, is when they say something like, well, look, you're not David.
Mm-hmm.
Right. In this situation, David is a type of Christ, and you're the person over there getting saved by David. That is true. It's also true that David is an image of good, that that the rest of the nation then sees him defeat the Philistine giant, and they charge off. Now that they've seen the giant defeated, they charge off and start killing Philistines.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, in that story, the image of good that their imagination is shifted and changed by seeing David kill Goliath. Now they say, oh, courage is, we should have courage because David had courage and he just killed a giant. And so that it turns the nation into giant killers. To see a giant killed in front of them, because that's the way the imagination works. The story we tell ourselves about who we are, and who we ought to be, ends up affecting our actions. So it's true that we're not David, and it's also true that David is a picture of who we ought to act like, right?
Yeah.
As we should be more like David in that story. We shouldn't be like him in some of the other stories.
Saul. You shouldn't be like the children of Israel, right? You should be like David in this story.
Right. And when David defeats the giant, the children of Israel become like David.
Right.
So, and that's why we sing songs. That's why they sang the song David killed, or Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Is they sing songs like that, so that more people will be like David. Right. That's what art does. That's how God created the world, such that the stories we tell, the art we make, affects the imagination, and that's how we know who we're supposed to be, and gain the courage to be able to be the people we're supposed to be. I mean, this is why in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, C.S. Lewis makes such a big deal out of what books Eustace hasn't read. He's read a lot of books, but these books were weak on dragons, so he didn't know what to do in those situations. He didn't have the imaginative, his imagination didn't have him prepped for the kinds of situations that he was going to find himself in Narnia.
Right.
And the point that Lewis is making is, which means that's why he wasn't prepped for the real world.
All right. So keep going. You are so St. George. I think that's where
Yeah.
you were at.
So you've got the and in the process of giving you images of the good, we're also given um the the monsters become images of evil, that the kind of evil that you defeat by being good. So you've got um you know
Yeah,
a
I got
mon
that. Yeah. That's
yeah,
page 81. Is that where you're pulling from right now?
yeah,
Where
yeah,
he's like, if the unveiling of good leads to immediate respect and reverence, it is quite the reverse with evil, right? So it's you see good and there's reverence there so evil is just right on the other side, like
right, exactly, yeah. And so you've got the
so you get
false,
fear and hate, or what was the reverence? It's the reverse
right,
of that. You get
you,
fear.
you get fear and irreverence, maybe, or something like that. So the and
Ah,
the and what's interesting too about, so you get both the you get the monsters that you can learn to recognize. So you've got the two-faced um monster that when you first meet her, she looks like a beautiful woman, but she's all rotten and snakes on the inside or on the back.
and
um
full of everything unclean.
Full of everything unclean, yeah. And that's the and you so you realize, like, sometimes evil presents itself in a beautiful form, but you've got to figure out the substance of it before you go with it. And then but then what do you do then? um you know uh, a courageous response is to then defeat the courage defeats evil. Or so, and sometimes it defeats it in its by losing to it, right? But so
Mm,
you charge in and you reveal that this is a monster because you charge in to fight it and it kills you, and now everybody else can see the monstrous nature, right? Where um the monstrous nature was invisible to a lot of people. But even in the giving yourself up and losing in a battle against evil, um, it is it's better to lose in a battle to evil so that everyone sees and then everyone sees the evil, than to not fight the evil because nobody can see it,
mm.
and to survive, right? So you've got those sorts of images of good, um, that we should that should affect and change, or can affect and change, our imagination. Um, and they're out and they're about and they're available even in our modern storytelling. You know, they're there. We just have a shallower view of the good, right?
So
But
then,
like,
if we have a shallow view of good, then we must have a shallow view of evil too, and that's part of what maybe I'm reading Lewis wrong here, but it seems part of our problem is that there's this kind of meh attitude between um, good and evil. Well, you do you, yeah, whatever you want to do, that's you. But when you have this very strong persona of good, or good is very present and it's very obvious, it makes evil very easy to see as well. The
yeah,
contrast is very present in evil because good is so strikingly different that it's like, well, whatever this isn't, that's evil. This is all good, right? Like, so this is like when good is here, all of a sudden, where darkness is. It's easy to see because this is light. And the two have this, clarity is made finally. And so you don't even know what, in one sense or another, how bad evil really is until good is revealed for what it is.
right. Yeah, and that's Tolkien is doing this same sort of thing with a character like Wormtongue, who
Mm.
has existed right alongside the king for years. And it's through lots of small compromises with evil that you
Ah,
have the king um, basically aged out of his knighthood. Um,
ah,
it right, so you have this strong, powerful knight who makes a ton of tiny compromises with evil, and it destroys his knighthood, rather than one big major compromise. And that image of evil, it becomes immediately clear when Gandalf steps into the room,
Right.
because there's no compromise with evil, right? And so then the compromise becomes clear because Gandalf steps into the room, right? And that's that's why you have, when he shows up at the door and he says, "Oh, I'll leave my sword," and it says, "Oh, your staff," and he says, "Oh, you wouldn't take an old man's staff from him, would you?" And you know exactly what's going to happen, because the staff is the real power. Is where the real power is. It's not in the sword. But because the staff was hard won through the self-sacrifice with the Balrog. That kind of
Mm-hmm.
power is won through sacrifice and goodness, and uncompromising courage. And so as soon as he steps in with the staff, Wormtongue doesn't have a chance, because now everybody can see it. What was invisible to them becomes visible when he shows up, and that's what we want to be. And I think you've got a handful of great examples in modern literature, but they're few and far between.
Who would you say in modern literature?
Well, I think a character like Dumbledore in Harry Potter,
Okay.
he has the honor.
Till they made him gay.
In the new movie.
Yeah, the new
movies. Yeah, that's a whole nother. I don't even think of
good.
the movie. Yeah, I don't even think of the movies as real or a part of the whole thing. Because
that's what it was. Fantastic.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I didn't even watch. I watched the first one and it was a lot of fun, but I didn't watch any of the other ones once Dumbledore arrives. But he is a character he's courageous, he's incredibly powerful, but it's always under control.
Yeah.
And he always even treats his enemies with respect and honor, and gives them the option of a way out, because he knows he's powerful enough to destroy them all. He never misuses his power, but he shows up and says, "I'm going to, here's an opportunity. Here's a way for you out. Would you like a way out? Because the only other option is I defeat you." You're that kind of he talks like the knights of the Middle Ages talked, in terms of his honor and his all of that, and you just don't really run into that. I mean, the Knights of the Round Table is the central story behind Harry Potter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is a modern retelling of the Knights of the Round Table, and including a lot of she uses the alchemical literary systems of the medieval writers. She's really, really brilliant. But Ginny, her full name is Guinevere. You learn later, so Harry is Arthur. It's really an Arthur character.
Wow.
So she's not just creating this out of whole cloth. She is coming at it and saying, how would you create an Arthurian world that you could move in and out of for modern people, in the same way that Narnia is an Arthurian world that you can move in and out of. So she's doing something similar, maybe without the depth that Lewis brings to it, but it's still a similar setup.
Yeah, so you're saying we don't have really, so outside of that, we really don't have any modern stories that, so then the Avengers, they fall short of what's good, of the image of good.
Eventually,
that's the biggest one.
Yeah, eventually they do, but it starts out in that same sort of setup. right? Why is it that we know, why is it that Iron Man is such a great hero? It's because he's willing to sacrifice himself. He's willing
Mhm.
to give it all up. So
Captain
you
America.
Captain America.
Yeah.
So it's the story of characters becoming the knights, but it's in a world where they don't make sense. So it's, if that
Mm,
makes, so to speak, right? So um it's, the world doesn't end up forming around them into a world where everybody wants to be a knight, the way that the Arthurian tales do that,
mhm.
because you don't walk away say, you might in your imagination say, man, if I had the kind of power Hulk has, something, but you don't, and you can't. And so it's harder to get there, but
Superheroes
it's not.
keep you from, yeah, that's interesting. Superheroes in one sense or another keep you from actually being able to do what they do, right? Like
Yeah,
unless you're super rich, unless you have some sort of accident, unless you're born in particular, you don't
right,
have that type of virtue is not necessarily attainable, right?
right.
Like uh,
And I think
something, yeah.
they tell us the right things, like Captain America, he couldn't be Captain America. It's not the strength that makes him Captain America, right? It's the moral, the his morality is what makes him Captain America.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's how they
yeah.
picked them.
And I mean, Samson is basically a superhero in the Old Testament that we're supposed to look at and say, oh, well, don't do that, but do this, right? Like, he ends up sacrificing himself with his arms out on, like he's on a cross, and pulling he's a pre he's a type of Christ, um, that brings down the kingdom in his own death. And so, but we don't have the we have fewer pictures of the good, and we have more, we tend towards irony. I mean, I think DC tried to give us an earnest world of superheroes,
Mm,
but people couldn't connect with it.
right.
Right, a world of earnest superheroes, the way that you have a world of earnest Knights of the Round Table, was really hard for people to connect with.
How do you develop, or how do you, yeah, I guess develop or create what is good, and how do you get it? Uh-oh.
Man, I think I, I think that we should actually be asking ourselves, what do I want my life to be like, and is that the right thing? Like,
Mm,
um, what what is my ideal lined up with God's ideal for me, right? What kind of creature am I, and what should the ideal be? Um,
it's going back to the
and
priest stuff, right?
right, yeah. So what am I fighting? Like, what am I fighting for? Because like we live in a weird time where power is considered a good in and of itself. Um,
Mm,
and the conservatives have fallen into it just as much as the liberals, and everybody, that's what everybody agrees on, is that power is that, it's a fight for power, and whoever gets it
gets to
gets to,
wield, yeah,
wield it, and
wield reality. Actually, it's not
wield
just
reality.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And so, um when somebody says, hey, what's your politics, um I usually say, I want my kids' soccer games to be more important than my president. Right.
Mm,
I don't. I want my kid's soccer coach to have more to be more important to my children's lives than the president. I I I, I want there to be a president. I want him to be over there, writing really good treaties and doing the things that the president's supposed to do. But I don't want him doing anything that affects my day in and day out life. I don't think politics should be that important in our life, right? Politics, the goal of the state is to protect space for the righteous to live safely. That's
Yeah,
the goal
that's a good. As you're
of the
saying this,
state.
I'm imagining a fence, and all we do is sit here and paint and rub around the fence. Like the fence is it. The fence is it.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, actually, the fence is there so that you can play soccer with your kids,
Right,
right?
exactly.
And so your
Right.
kids are safe when they play soccer, right? And so that
Yeah.
your dog can run around and you can play and have a great barbecue. Like that's. And so you shouldn't even notice it in one sense. It's just doing its job, right?
Right. Yeah, we had some the house across the street from us has an elderly gentleman who had to move into an old folks home, and so his house is sat empty, and some squatters tried to move in, and it took almost no time before the men in the 4 houses on either side and across the street, we were there defending this guy's house from these squatters. So by the time the cops got there, to, and the in the sister and brother-in-law and got there, um we already had, hey, here's pictures of them, here's what they're doing, and we've we've basically kicked them out of the house twice, um and so they go in and change the locks and everything, and it's like, so by the time the cops got there, the neighborhood had already defended its neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
Right. At one point, me and the guy across the street were confronting this 19, 20-year-old that was trying to squat there, saying, "Hey, get out of here. This isn't your house. We know the guy who lives here. He's not you. You're a 20-year-old white kid. He's a 80-year-old black guy, and this isn't your house." And he was like, "Well, I'm just walking through." And it was like, "Well, then keep walking, because this isn't your neighborhood." And he he was like, "Man, you guys are messed up." And the response was, "No, we're neighbors. This is what neighbors
Mm.
do. We take care of one another. And this is the kind of neighborhood you're walking through. So you need to keep going, because it's not your neighborhood, and this is not your house." And so they had broken in the back door and had been squatting
Ouch.
for just a couple of days before, because it's a neighborhood where the men all know each other, right? And we're all on a text thread, and so we got a text, "Hey, there's somebody's trying to sneak into that house." Everybody shows up, right? We've kept the guy's lawn mowed for 5 years, and his bushes trimmed, and because he's our neighbor, and so he can't be there to defend his house, so we are. That's the kind of world I want to live in. But you have to, that means when you see something, you have to walk across the street and be there. um it, it's yeah, it's a way of imagining the kind of world you want, um and then trying to see it come to pass.
So then, yeah. So then but you need to know what good is, though, don't you? Like, so.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. So, we were having dinner, and I got a text from the neighbor, "Hey, somebody sneaking into the house across the street." Right. So I jump up, run out the house. I should have grabbed something like a fork, at least brought my fork or something. Instead, I just run across the street, right? Because this is what you do. You don't be and my other neighbor do the same thing, right? So we both kind of show up at the same time. And but it's not because but and then I come back in, and Aaron and the kids were like, "What was that about?" You know, and hadn't even it's what
You
you
just
do.
do it. Yeah.
You just do it, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what Reaper Cheap would do, right?
Right.
Like, you don't
I think Reaper Cheap would have his sword, though. I'm just
he
saying.
would have he
Yeah.
wouldn't have been without his sword in the first place.
No.
Yeah. So,
No.
but um the it's just it's a matter of saying, this is what we do because it's right,
Yeah.
right? And not thinking pragmatically, but thinking in terms of this is my neighborhood, this is my family, this is
Yeah.
this spot should be safer because I'm here. And there's other aspects besides just confronting monsters, that are images of the good, but that's just the one we've been talking about. You want the elderly and children and women to be safer because you're around. That's and whether or not that just you have to want it and then act on it and then trust the Lord.
I just think that this is give me a chance to talk about theonomy again. I just don't think that people have an understanding of what good is on an objective level. And it's because they're so ignorant of what God has called good. And I've been working through this with my kids. It's like, idolatry is bad, right? That's one of the
Right.
things that we need to make sure we understand really well. And when people think about good, like you said, they don't have, that means true worship is good, right? So like true worship, worshiping the triune God, understanding who you worship is essential. Like when you're talking about like as a priest, you're a priest, you have a responsibility immediately to the true worship of God. And where you see that lacks at, you do what you did. You stand up and you say, "You shall not do this to my neighbor," because
Right.
that's my neighbor, and I'm after his good name. You can't steal from him. You can't lie about him. You can't, take his wife. You can't covet his thing. Those are things that are built into what it means to be good. Like that is good, right? Those are stealing is bad, giving, support, love, seeking his good name, honoring his things. Those are good. That's good. That is objectively good. But that all comes from true and right worship. And if you don't have that set, which is kind of going back to the beginning of our whole conversation about our liturgy, right? If you don't have, you can only be as good as you understand true and right worship, right? Like that is bottom line, right? And a culture that has those things put in place, it does become kind of what I think some of the people who are fearing right now with the conversation on Christendom, they're fearing nominal Christianity, right? And it's like, but there's going to be a culture of people that are going to follow in the lines of the ones who are being righteous. And they might not be as righteous, but they're going to like, that's the way the society is going. That's the way that we're going. They're like, well, when David killed Goliath, the army rose up and acted like David, right? So, but I don't think that we understand the law of God well enough to be able to. I was just on Twitter. I got in trouble with Scott Aniol on Twitter, which was like silly, the silliest thing ever. Like, come on. But anyway, one of the things that people were talking about was just how useless the law of God was. And there's just guys going on there. And I asked him, I said, do your children have to obey you? And he's like, no, they don't have to. I'm like, wait. I thought there was a promise that came with this. So he doesn't know what good is, right?
Right.
So I don't when guys like that start talking, they don't know what good is. I don't look for them. Actually, I do. I don't look for them in a fight, except for to make sure they're not going to stab me in the back.
Right.
Right? Because if they think that way, there is that kind of cosmology has an effect when it comes time to throw. Right? It has when it comes time when the rubber meets the road, it tells you everything you need to know about that person. And COVID for me has been kind of that moment where it's time to throw. And I learned everything I need to know about a lot of people. I figured out who the leaders were, and I figured out who the followers were, and I figured out who the enemies were. I saw good and evil clearly unmasked in that moment. And I saw a lot of people not having an objective reality of what good is. And they're failing in the same way, I think, on they're doing better on the transgender stuff, but they're still failing because It is not good for you to give your kids to government education and then to fight with that government system on what they can and can't teach your kids. That's not the good thing to do is like repent and say, I've abdicated my responsibilities to my children, that I have to argue with I'm arguing with the doggone dragon on which kids he can eat. You know what I'm saying? And everybody's
Totally.
like, let's pass more laws so we can get them to eat less kids. That's not it, guys.
Right.
That's a very low. I mean, praise God that they're actually flexing some of these muscles that they haven't flexed before. But we need a clearer, better understanding of objective good so that it becomes very obvious to a lot more people, right? And so that's what's like, okay, how do you develop that? And I don't know any other way of just saying, okay, you got to go back to really basic principles here and say, what is true worship of God? What does God require of us? That we love him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor ourselves. Okay, where's God's standard for understanding truth and righteousness? The scriptures principally teach what man is to know and believe about God and what duty that God requires of man. Boom, there you go. All right, there. I just think we've lost so many of those basic 101, right? Almost in one sense or another, Jason, I think it's the same way with knights. We have no oaths. We have no covenant. Like when you come under covenant, it has ethics to it, right?
Yeah.
And it has sanctions to it. We just don't, our covenant thinking is so broken that we don't know what we've sworn allegiance to.
Yeah. And I think we don't realize how when we start talking about discipleship, we don't think in terms of the whole man,
Right.
the whole person. We think in terms of stopping certain things. So we think of discipleship nihilistically.
It's nihilistically. Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah. Don't do this. Don't.
Yeah. Here's the thing. So, there's certain sins that I'm going to stop, and that's my discipleship, rather than, thinking in terms of discipling the whole person. And that a big part of that is discipling the imagination. We don't, even the way we read the Bible, we read it moralistically, thinking, okay, am I getting the rules right from the Bible? Is this person somebody I'm supposed to imitate or not? Because did they follow the rules or not? Rather than letting the Bible come and disciple our imagination, giving us the wisdom of categories by which to judge, stories by which we judge, characters by which we judge who we're called to be and what we're trying to be. And I think that's what Spencer is doing. That's what Lewis is pointing out, and what is lacking and it's one of the reasons that I think, we think in terms of we think about, when we go to educate, we think in terms of surviving. Are they surviving the education, first off, intact? And then does their education give them skills they need to get a job and make money? And then we think that's what an education is, rather than thinking, well, no, is this education discipling them into their priesthood, discipling them into the positive vision that God has given them for their lives? Is it prepping them for the home building and the world conquering, the adventures, which are the two things that we're told to do? Go out and take dominion and multiply. Build, have an adventure and build a home. Here's the two aspects of your kingship that we do as priests. is conquer and home make. And so, that's we don't prep for reality. We prep for something different. And so we end up unprepared when we meet reality.
All right. So how far do we actually get into this chapter? Where do we need to go from there? I think page 81.
We made 3 pages.
3 pages. All right.